You think you can waltz in here and lecture me? Get up. Detective Carson Reeves's voice cut through the courtroom like a jagged blade. To him, her calm demeanor was an offense. "I've been on the force for 20 years, he spat, leaning close enough that Elena could smell his stale coffee breath. "You're going to tell me how to conduct an investigation?" "The evidence is clear," Elena responded, her voice steady as granite. "Listen here, girl," Reeves growled, his face reddening. "Some people aren't cut out for real police work." He stepped closer, towering over her, his bulk meant to intimidate. Reeves thought he was putting her in her place. Instead, he was about to destroy his own career. Because Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a lieutenant. She was about to become the city's first Latina police chief. Calm, controlled, waiting. What will happen when the truth comes out? How will Reeves react when he discovers her true power? Will his years of prejudice finally catch up to him? The municipal courthouse stood like a granite fortress in the heart of downtown, its imposing columns a testament to institutional power. Inside, the corridors buzzed with the constant hum of legal machinery. Lawyers shuffling papers, clerks moving files, the distant echo of judges' chambers. Lieutenant Elena Rodriguez moved through this world with practiced precision, her tailored navy suit a sharp contrast to the weathered walls around her. At 42, Elena carried the weight of 2 decades in law enforcement. Her parents, a schoolteacher and a factory worker, had instilled in her a profound respect for justice that went beyond mere procedure. She'd climbed the ranks not through political maneuvering, but through pure, unyielding competence. Every case, every report, every investigation was a battle against a system that had never been designed to welcome someone who looked like her. Detective Carson Reeves represented the old guard she'd been fighting her entire career. 55 years old, with a belly that spoke of too many late-night stakeouts and greasy diner meals, he embodied the kind of policing that saw diversity as a threat rather than a strength. His file was a mixed bag. Commendations for tough arrests mixed with quiet complaints about racial profiling that never seemed to stick. Today's confrontation was about more than just a single investigation. It was about a systemic failure that Elena had spent her entire career trying to expose. The case in question involved a drug raid that had gone catastrophically wrong. 6 months ago, Reeves and his team had executed a warrant based on what Elena knew was flimsy, racially motivated intelligence. 3 innocent families had their lives destroyed in the process. As she reviewed the case files one last time, Elena knew this was about more than just professional correction. This was about accountability, about proving that the badge meant something more than a license to intimidate. Her upcoming appointment as police chief wasn't just a promotion, it was a weapon of institutional change. Reeves didn't know it yet, but the man who had just publicly attempted to humiliate her would soon be answering directly to her. The irony was not lost on Elena. She had spent years building a case, not just against individual officers, but against a culture of unchecked power and systemic racism. And today, that case was about to go to trial. The courtroom waited. Justice was about to be served. The tension between Elena and Reeves had been building for months, a slow-burning fuse of institutional resentment. What started as professional disagreement had morphed into something far more personal, a microcosm of the deeper conflicts plaguing modern law enforcement. Judge Marcus Holloway watched the exchange with a mixture of concern and resignation. He'd seen this dance before, veteran officers threatened by change, younger leaders demanding accountability. But there was something different about Lieutenant Rodriguez. She wasn't just challenging the system, she was systematically dismantling its most problematic foundations. "Your investigation compromised multiple ongoing operations," Elena stated, her voice cutting through Reeves's bluster. "The intelligence was fabricated, the warrant was improperly secured, and 3 families lost everything because of your department's recklessness." Reeves's face reddened. "You don't understand street-level policing. These weren't innocent families. They were harboring criminals." "No," Elena countered, sliding a thick file across the table. "They were community members, parents, working-class citizens who now have federal civil rights lawsuits pending against the department." The courtroom fell silent. Junior officers shifted uncomfortably. Veteran detectives avoided eye contact. Everyone knew what was really happening. A fundamental power struggle was unfolding, with Elena Rodriguez as its unlikely protagonist. What Reeves didn't realize was that this hearing was more than a professional review. It was the first public step in Elena's plan to transform the police department from within. Each accusation, each piece of evidence was carefully constructed, not just to expose his failures, but to demonstrate a path toward genuine community-centered policing. His aggressive posturing was a last-gasp defense mechanism. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the room, that the world he knew was ending. The old boys' network, the unquestioned authority, the ability to police with impunity, all of it was crumbling. And Elena Rodriguez was the sledgehammer bringing it down. The hearing continued, each moment adding another layer to the inevitable confrontation. Reeves had no idea how completely his world was about to be dismantled. The moment erupted like a sudden thunderclap. Reeves, pushed beyond his professional facade, finally lost control. "You think you can come in here and lecture me?" he shouted, his hand slamming against the wooden table. "I've forgotten more about police work than you'll ever know." Elena didn't flinch. Her silence was more powerful than any words. Judge Holloway intervened. "Detective Reeves, control yourself." But Reeves was beyond reason. Years of frustration, of feeling the ground shifting beneath his feet, exploded in that moment. His racist undertones became razor-sharp accusations, no longer hidden behind professional courtesies. "This is what's wrong with the department," he spat. "Diversity, hires thinking they can rewrite decades of proven policing." The courtroom went dead silent. Even his fellow officers looked uncomfortable. Elena's response was measured, devastating. "Your definition of proven policing includes destroying innocent lives, violating constitutional rights, targeting communities based on race and economic status." Each word was a surgical strike, dismantling not just Reeves's credibility, but the entire systemic approach he represented. What Reeves didn't know, what no one in that room knew except Elena, was that she had already been selected as the next police chief. This hearing wasn't just an investigation. It was her first act of institutional transformation, and Carson Reeves was about to become her first example. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Elena's meticulously documented evidence transformed what could have been a routine hearing into a departmental earthquake. Internal Affairs opened a full investigation into Reeves's conduct, his decades of service suddenly under microscopic examination. Colleagues who once protected him now distanced themselves. The thin blue line that had shielded problematic officers for generations began to crack and splinter. Elena watched with calculated calm. This wasn't personal revenge. This was systematic reform. By the time the dust settled, Reeves would understand that challenging her was the worst mistake of his career. The internal investigation moved with surgical precision. Elena's appointment as police chief was strategically timed. She would oversee the very proceedings that would dismantle Reeves's career. Investigators combed through 2 decades of his case files. What emerged was a damning portrait of systemic misconduct. False reports, fabricated evidence, racially motivated arrests. Each document was another nail in Reeves's professional coffin. Junior officers who had once feared him now came forward with stories of casual racism, of investigations deliberately mishandled, of communities systematically targeted. The wall of silence that had protected generations of problematic cops was crumbling. Elena orchestrated the investigation like a master strategist. She understood that this was about more than one detective. This was about transforming an entire culture of policing. Reeves knew something was happening. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. Colleagues who once shared drinks with him now avoided eye contact. His phone calls went unreturned. The network that had protected him for decades was dissolving. When the preliminary report landed on his desk, the reality of his situation became clear. This wasn't just a professional reprimand. This was a complete institutional dismantling of everything he represented. Elena's approach was brilliant. She didn't just want to fire Reeves. She wanted to expose the systemic failures that had allowed his behavior to persist for so long. The city council meeting was packed. Typically, boring municipal proceedings had been transformed into a high-stakes drama of institutional accountability. Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium, her presentation a masterclass in systematic exposure. Case after case, statistic after statistic, she methodically dismantled the old guard's approach to policing. Reeves sat in the back, watching his entire professional world collapse. "For too long," she stated, her voice clear and unwavering, "our department has prioritized control over community, intimidation over protection." When she revealed her complete dossier on Reeves, detailing not just his individual misconduct, but the systemic failures that had enabled his behavior, the room went silent. Reeves tried to interrupt. "This is political correctness gone mad." But no one was listening to him anymore. The city council's vote was unanimous. Reeves would be stripped of his pension, his badge, his entire professional identity. More than that, criminal investigations would be launched into his past conduct. What made the moment truly devastating wasn't just the professional destruction. It was the complete and total loss of status. Everything Reeves had built his identity around was being methodically dismantled. Elena watched without malice. This wasn't personal. This was institutional healing. The fallout was immediate and comprehensive. Reeves's career wasn't just ended, it was thoroughly discredited. Federal investigators began reviewing dozens of past cases he had been involved with. Families who had been wrongly targeted now had a clear path to justice. The very system Reeves had exploited was now his most powerful enemy. Media coverage was relentless. "Veteran detective exposed, decades of misconduct revealed," headlines blared. Every skeleton in Reeves's professional closet was dragged into the light. Local news stations ran in-depth investigations, tracing the pattern of his misconduct through years of unchecked abuse. Former colleagues who had protected him now distanced themselves, afraid the investigation might reveal their own complicity. The brotherhood that had shielded problematic officers for generations was fracturing. What once seemed like an unbreakable code of silence was now crumbling under the weight of institutional accountability. Elena's approach was strategic. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about systematic reform. Each revelation was carefully documented, each instance of misconduct meticulously traced. She understood that Reeves was merely a symptom of a much larger problem within law enforcement. Community groups that had long complained about discriminatory policing now found themselves vindicated. Protest groups that had been marginalized for years suddenly had concrete evidence supporting their claims. The narrative was shifting from individual misconduct to a comprehensive examination of systemic racism in law enforcement. Reeves's personal life began to unravel. His wife filed for divorce, unable to withstand the public shame. His adult children distanced themselves, embarrassed by the national spotlight exposing their father's misconduct. The man who had once been a respected detective was now a pariah, his entire legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Financial consequences followed quickly. Civil lawsuits began mounting. families of those wrongly arrested, communities systematically targeted, individuals whose lives had been destroyed by his racist policing practices. Each lawsuit was another blow to his rapidly diminishing resources. The internal affairs investigation became a forensic dismantling of his entire career. Every case file was reopened, every arrest scrutinized. What emerged was a devastating portrait of a police officer who had weaponized his badge against the very communities he was sworn to protect. Elena watched the proceedings with a calm, calculated precision. This wasn't about destroying one man. This was about exposing a system that had protected and enabled such behavior for generations. Each revelation was a step toward genuine institutional change, a path toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Reeves had become more than just a disgraced detective. He was now the primary exhibit in a national conversation about police accountability and systemic racism. The federal investigation transformed from an internal review to a full-scale systematic examination of the police department's practices. Elena Rodriguez understood that Reeves was merely a symptom of a much larger problem, a culture of unchecked power and systemic racism that had infected law enforcement for generations. Department of Justice investigators descended on the precinct, their presence both a surgical instrument and a warning. Every file, every report, every disciplinary record became evidence. Reeves watched in horror as his entire professional legacy was dissected, page by page, case by case. What emerged was more than just a case against one detective. It was an indictment of an entire system of policing that had prioritized control over community, intimidation over protection. Former colleagues who had once stood silent now found themselves called to testify. The protective networks that had shielded misconduct for decades suddenly crumbling. Elena's approach was strategic. She didn't want mere punishment. She wanted fundamental change. Each revelation was carefully documented, each systemic failure methodically exposed. Reeves represented more than just an individual bad actor. He was a living symbol of everything wrong with traditional law enforcement. The media circus grew. National news outlets picked up the story, transforming a local investigation into a national conversation about police accountability. Community leaders who had long complained about discriminatory policing now found themselves vindicated, their decades of protest finally receiving mainstream attention. For Reeves, the nightmare was just beginning. Criminal charges were being prepared. Civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, systematic discrimination. The list of potential charges grew longer with each passing day. The very system he had exploited for years was now his most brutal prosecutor. Elena watched the proceedings with a calm that belied the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't personal revenge. This was institutional healing. Every exposed file, every testimony, every documented instance of misconduct was a step toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they were meant to serve. Reeves had no idea how completely his world was about to be dismantled. The detective who had built his career on intimidation was about to become the primary exhibit in a case study of systemic police reform. The courtroom felt different when Reeves finally faced formal charges. Gone was his swagger, his belief in institutional protection. He sat defeated, a shell of the intimidating detective who had once ruled through fear and prejudice. Federal prosecutors presented a case so comprehensive, so meticulously documented that Reeves's defense seemed almost laughable. Elena Rodriguez sat in the gallery, her presence a quiet testament to the institutional change unfolding. Witness after witness testified, community members who had been wrongly targeted, colleagues who had witnessed his misconduct, internal documents that revealed a pattern of systematic discrimination that stretched back decades. Each testimony was another nail in Reeves's professional coffin. The charges were devastating. Multiple counts of civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, systematic racial profiling. What had once been whispered complaints were now official federal indictments. The thin blue line that had protected problematic officers for generations had been completely shattered. When Elena took the stand, her testimony was devastating in its calm precision. She didn't grandstand. She simply presented facts, meticulously documented evidence of Reeves's systematic misconduct. Her professional demeanor stood in sharp contrast to Reeves' increasingly desperate attempts at defense. The jury's verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentencing would ensure Reeves would never wear a badge again, his pension stripped, his professional reputation destroyed. But for Elena, this was never about personal victory. This was about fundamental institutional transformation. Each successful prosecution was a step toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. As Reeves was led away, Elena understood the true victory wasn't in his downfall. It was in the systemic changes that would follow: new training protocols, comprehensive accountability measures, a complete reimagining of community policing. The detective who had once tried to humiliate her in court was now a footnote in a much larger story of institutional reform. In the months that followed, Elena Rodriguez's appointment as police chief became a turning point. The department underwent a complete transformation, not just in leadership, but in fundamental approach. Community engagement programs were developed. Comprehensive bias training became mandatory. Recruitment practices were overhauled to create a force that truly reflected the community it served. Reeves became a cautionary tale, a symbol of an outdated, destructive approach to law enforcement. His story was used in training sessions, a powerful reminder of the consequences of systemic racism and unchecked power. Elena knew the work was far from over. Institutional change was a marathon, not a sprint. But each small victory, each policy changed, each officer held accountable, was a step toward genuine justice. Her approach was never about revenge, it was about healing, about creating a law enforcement system that truly served all communities, regardless of race, economic status, or background. As she looked out over the precinct, now transformed, more diverse, more accountable, Elena understood that true justice was not about punishment. It was about creating systems that prevented injustice from happening in the first place. The story of Carson Reeves was over. The story of institutional transformation was just beginning. Racist cop attacks. Black woman in court without knowing she's his new police chief.